very much. I was shaking my head at the scientist part, not the. I kind of could care less how my name is pronounced, but the scientist part is, in my line of work, those are people who, I don't know, they do science, and I'm a maybe a meta scientist, but that's as close as I'll get. I'm really pleased to be here and was really excited about the opportunity. But I want to sort of maybe set the stage a little bit before and I'm really going to rush, I'm not going to rush through the talking, I'm going to rush through the slides part because I really would much more like to have a conversation about these issues than bore you with all of that. And it's more sort of things to talk about than it is what I think about them, but that's, you can decide yourselves. But I want to just sort of set the stage a little bit. Again, Adam Marcus and I co-founded Retraction Watch. It's going on 15 years ago now, in 2010. So we've been doing this for quite a bit, and it remains it remains a volunteer activity, which is one thing, but it remains a real privilege and just amazing learning experience for me and for all of us who are involved in that. I want to start by just saying a bit about when I was invited, when Anna made the very kind invitation. I had to think about it. I mean, not in the way that you always think about, well, should I travel and do all these things, and do I have time, and all the rest of it, but a little bit in terms of what my, if you will, message was going to be, because I felt a little bit like I was going to be, zagging where a lot of you might have been zigging. Now, this is a crowd that zigs and zags at the same time, so that felt pretty comfortable. But I do want to warn you that I may do that a little bit. However, in my sort of own, what I would like to think is my own sort of epistemological, see, I'm a semi-academic, I can talk like that, sort of humility, I realized that sort of what I thought I was going to say, and what I thought I had sort of concluded in the, again, 14 plus years of work at Retraction Watch, was actually itself a little bit wrong, a little bit sort of not, certainly, and the way I really think about that is it wasn't the full picture. And that's what I'm going to try and do today. There's a rule in journalism, some of you may know, it's called Bettridge's Law, right? It's not a real law or anything, but it's a fun one. And that is that if a headline asks a question, the answer is always no. I'm sorry to tell you, the answer is you're going to have to figure it out yourself in this case, which is, I think, a better version in terms of my question. Let me say what a retraction is, because I think you all know this, and in fact, I was very pleased that some of the cases that I'm going to zoom through in a minute were actually already mentioned. So a lot of you, I'm sure, are quite familiar with these and what it is. But I want to be very precise about what a retraction is. It's a signal, right? And it should come along with a notice that explains what happened. But it's a signal. You should not rely on what you're about to read. That's really it. It's not reliable. Now, I'm not saying that is or isn't true. I'm saying that's what it is signaling, right? And so that's all it is. And it is not, although it has a stigma, and although a lot of the time, and I'll discuss this briefly, it is actually due to misconduct, not honest error. I'll give you a little bit of statistics on that in a minute. That's all it says. Now, the cool, interesting part that we like to look at is why it actually happened, how it happened, should it have happened, all of that. But I just want to be clear on what that is. And just a little bit about me, at the risk, I guess, of being a sort of, I don't know, postmodernist or something, but I do think it's important you know a few things about me. One is that I'm kind of a stay-in-my-lane kind of guy. And what I don't tell other people what they should do, but I like to sort of focus and only really opine on, if at all, things that I've actually looked at myself in an empirical way, and I would put retractions in that category. I'm an incrementalist. I actually believe in institutions, but I think, as we heard earlier, that there are ways to make them better. That's what we're trying to do at Retraction Watch. And also, I'm sorry, good, you walked in right on time. I'm not going to create a shrine to Jonathan Rauch. I don't know if it's my, Jewish upbringing. We have a thing about idols, but I'm not a shrine kind of guy. And I say that in all jest, knowing that that was, of course, meant tongue-in-cheek, that anyone here would create a shrine of anything, but I do want to just sort of note that. Okay, so let me get started for real now. Okay, I'm going to actually close this. So I want to, again, my sort of fundamental question is, or thought sort of experiment or thought encouragement is, your paper was retracted, right? Were you censored or were you just wrong? Right? And by the way, the answer could be both. But I want to say that, again, retractions happen for all sorts of reasons. They also happen in all sorts of fields. the vast majority of which, from our point of view, because we look at literally there are now 55,000 retractions in our database, the vast majority of which, again, as a somewhat uneducated sort of layperson when it comes to political anything, or social or sociological anything, do not have any political or sociological valence, or at least it's so minimal that that's clearly not involved. And I want to put that in context because I think sometimes we all tend to, and I do the same, focus on what is salient to us and what is sort of important to us, and then sort of maybe obscure in our own thinking what's the bigger picture. And that's what I'm trying to do, right? And in all seriousness, what I'm really trying to do is not sort of provoke in a way that says, well, you were maybe just wrong, but sort of have you understand at least our understanding of how often retractions happen, how more often they should happen, which is far more interesting and important to me, and where we go from here. So I'm going to zoom through these. You can look up any of these from on Retraction Watch, you can look at coverage elsewhere of any of these cases, but I want to provide some examples, some of which you've already seen. So here's a case from, we're now in 2025, so this was earlier last year, where just as, miraculously you might say, just as some papers were about to be cited in Supreme Court cases, they were retracted. And some of the reasons why they were retracted were very procedural, and I'm going to talk about sort of what that means in various cases and why I think that's problematic. Some of them were, I would argue, legitimate in terms of, and conflict of interest is sort of a thing that could be seen as procedural, but there were some sort of particular cases here. However, it's a good example of something that, nobody was paying attention to until all of a sudden they were for particular reasons, whether you want to call them political, partisan, whatever it is. And so, again, were the standards different? That's an open question, but certainly it wouldn't have happened had all of that not been happening. Sticking on abortion for a second, this is someone who, again, that's C-SPAN, which means she was testifying in some sort of legislative hearing. This is, again, something that was, critiqued very vociferously because it sort of argued against what, and I think Lee talked about this, sort of the prevailing, mindset, the prevailing sort of idea that, abortion was always safe, et cetera. You've already heard about this, the Gilly story. It is, of course, it's always more complex than any of us realize, but, there were these credible threats of personal violence, which no one ever talked about, although I can understand sometimes why that is. Again, this was a case where, Lee used the word mob. I don't love the word. I'm not arguing with you, Lee, as much as saying, like, we try not to label as much as possible, but I get it. But there was clearly a mob, if lack of a better term. You're all probably familiar with Richard Lynn, the late Richard Lynn, and the criticism that his work engendered. Similar sort of case. Someone actually came out and said years later, the data themselves need a, quote, public health warning. Interesting idea. You also, heard about, of course, this already from, I believe it was Bill who was citing this, but, this is the paper about mentorship, and sort of, again, it went against the prevailing sort of what people wanted to be true, for lack of a better sort of description. And so here's a case where, that was retracted, and then it led to this editorial saying, we have to be more careful what we do and what we say, and it might contradict, et cetera. Again, now let me pull back to something that is, again, it clearly has political or at least geopolitical valence, but it isn't the sorts of things that at least I'm familiar with it, having been familiar with the Heterodox Academy, familiar with a lot of your work anyway. I'm certainly not all of it. Tech, is sort of necessarily in your crosshairs, although I'm sure it is. But the point is, it's not sociologically, politically sort of partisan. But as you think about China versus the U.S. kind of partisanship, this is absolutely the case. But it's my way of introducing the idea that this is, again, biology. It's about where the pandemic started. It's about all sorts of things, but it's also about just like not making China look bad. And this was a piece in the Times, et cetera. But, and you can't quite see it, I apologize, but that other one, the second item down there, is also about China. This is about when publishers really don't want to piss off China, right? And so one of the things they do is you're not allowed to describe Taiwan and Hong Kong in certain ways, right? Same way they do this with, I believe you said you were from Israel earlier. You know, when they talk about, I don't want to get into the whole debate here, but you know, territories or whatever we're calling them. You know, and you're not allowed to basically say things a certain way, and in fact, they will retract or sort of remove entire volumes, entire books, if you do that at the behest of the Chinese government. I mean, this is clearly what's happening. But I want to now maybe tweak you a little bit. I want to provoke some thought a little bit. And I want to say that just like, and this is why we don't love labels at Retraction Watch, just like every other word, you know, claiming this ism or that ism, or the paper is, you know, it's racist or sexist, what have you, on sort of one, if you will, side of things, claiming censorship when there actually is pretty credible evidence that papers were, you know, wrong, that's kind of a problem. And I think this is a case of it. It's just one. There are multiple cases. In fact, this story, this slide is already out of date because just yesterday, Peter McCullough and his co-authors had another paper retracted. So he's arguing for ivermectin. He's arguing for hydroxychloroquine, all the rest of it. And like, again, I'm not going to sort of, we can if you want. I don't think it's the best use of our time to sort of litigate like, well, this was correct, this was correct. We can do that, but I think it's more important to sort of just look at what he did with this, which is that he sort of said, we are censoring this. There was a paper that came out in Public Understanding of Science, which, by the way, as a medical person, it's a really unfortunate acronym, but apparently didn't occur to anyone else. You know, it's just not what I would have done, but hey. So anyway, but it's an interesting paper, and it's really just a case report with some data about a case series, I guess, or something, 2 cases of this sort of thing. I think it's worth thinking about, like using that word, shouting fire in a crowded theater sort of stuff. And what I want to also get to, because I think it's really important to look at who is actually being censored, right? And to look at everyone who is actually being censored, is that the critics of McCullough and et al. Actually faced, you might argue, even worse censorship, and they couldn't get anything published. And this, Lee is going to sort of react a little bit, and I'm going to get to this in a couple minutes, to this idea that what you should do is sort of publish a refutation or a letter to the editor. Like, I'm just going to say it, that doesn't fucking work. And like, it doesn't work in any number of ways that I'm happy to describe, but it just doesn't work. And it actually is, I would argue, a level of censorship, structural censorship, that is just as bad. But again, we can talk about that. So okay, those are all case reports, case studies, whatever you want to call them. Let me contextualize retractions, right? This is as much data as you're really going to get from me. I'm not a scientist. This is from Nature last year. The numbers are already out of date, as you would imagine. Actually, it wasn't last year. Sorry, now it's end of 2023. Basically, retractions are growing. That's the headline here. And you know, for the purposes of a short talk, I'm just going to say they're growing, and I'm going to tell you briefly why they're growing. 2023 was an outlier. It actually wasn't as high in 2024. That's because of these things called paper mills, which probably a lot of you heard about. But basically, that's what happened there. There's one particular publisher that was responsible for the vast majority of them. Okay, fine. But the rate isn't, right? So we want to talk not just about the overall number, but the actual rate. And the rate has gone from about 1 in 5,000 papers to about 1 in 500 papers. We think it should be much higher. And that's where I'm going with all of that, right? And so the role of the sleuths, I just want to mention these people because to me, they are doing the kind of the actual hard work and the completely unsung and dangerous work of trying to correct the scientific record. We just created this week, well, we've been creating it for time, but we announced it this week, a Sleuth in Residence program, which we're really excited about. We have some funding for that. It's awesome. Like, I, of course, think it's awesome, but if you know anybody, we're still taking applications. It's we want to both protect people by giving them coverage, defamation coverage that we have, but also actually pay them a salary. Not one that you could live on in New York or LA, to be perfectly honest with you, but something which is a lot more than the $0 most of them are making. They're doing the work of finding all the problems in literature. Some of you who are finding problems in whatever literature it is you're involved in are also sleuths. I mean, again, I don't love labels, and here I am using one, but at least lowercase s. You want to talk about, by the way, being canceled. Like, we didn't write that headline, but using the word czars in a headline is like it's not awesome. So anyway, but the important thing is some publishers are actually doing something about this. Still a small number, but they're actually doing something about this and hiring people to look at these allegations and to actually review things before they're published. But as I said before, we think the number should be much higher. And so I'll be very brief here, but basically this is a case where most of the time in 2016, when David Allison, who's now a dean at Indiana University School of Public Health, wrote about this, found problems in the literature with his grad students, he, 2/3 of the time the journals completely ignored him. And that's, by the way, David Allison, not, and not that people should ignore random grad students either, but even David Allison. Elizabeth Bick, whose name you may know if you follow sort of the biomedical literature and retractions at all. She's the one person you would have heard of if you only heard of one person. She found, and this is where we think it should probably be, is about, we think 2% of the literature, and people not yelled at us, but sort of said we were being too conservative, so other people think it should be even higher. About 1 in 50 papers we think should be retracted, based on, and you saw Lee pulled up the COPE guidelines, based on, we think reasonable interpretations of the COPE guidelines, about 2% should be retracted. So what am I trying to say there, right? What I'm trying to say is there's a massive gulf, a massive delta between the number of papers that actually are retracted or even corrected and the number that should be. So I'm trying to contextualize any discussion of censorship or any discussion of my paper shouldn't have been retracted, right? Because what we care about is retractions in the larger context of yeah, but. And the yeah, but is, or yeah, and, many more papers should be retracted. So, are you, I don't know what the right metaphor is, but if you're thinking about this as a wave or an ocean or something, like, are you walking into the ocean? I'm not sure that's why I don't use metaphors in my writing. But my point is, like, I think it's important to contextualize that and say that nobody wants to retract, right? These are headlines from Retraction Watch, based on, by the way, not just like random people saying something's wrong with a paper, but universities. And these are all biomedical, just in case you're thinking, oh, well, that's because it was politically valent or whatever. It's not. Politically valent is probably not a phrase, so strike that. But this is when you had official letterhead stuff, right? I know there's a general counsel in the room, but it would have had someone like his signature on it, and the journals do nothing. So nobody wants to. Why? Well, again, consistent with that, fine. Interest of time, I want to move on. I testified in the UK Parliament or Commons committee about this. They said, hey, it's got to be much quicker. I did the same thing in Canada end of last year, and they seem to think that's true. You can't see this probably, and I can barely see it, but basically, this is saying that even when papers are retracted, people keep citing them, right, as if they hadn't been, like the vast majority of the time. We're not talking about like, oh, it's a little bit. It's like 95% of the time, right? There are lots of reasons for that. Adam and I just this week published an editorial that we tongue-in-cheek said, please don't cite this editorial, right? Look it up. We had some fun with it. You may hate it, fine. But we take hate traffic too. Nobody wants to retract. Now there are, again, sort of like tribal, if you will, maybe we can still use that word, but sort of, I agree with you, I disagree with you, so therefore this, that, and the other thing. And a lot of the reasons we're talking about here today, but there's a bigger reason, right? And I think that if we're thinking about, the sort of knowledge and sort of how to think about the structure of all of this and the big picture, we have to think about citations, we have to think about rankings, we have to think about, how many banners every university has, about, where they're ranked, and it's based not exclusively, but heavily, I would say, on citations. You can't get cited if you don't get published, right? You can't, so therefore, publish or perish, we all know what that is. That to us is the big thing that is keeping, retractions and other kinds of corrections from happening. And in fact, if you retract and it says honest error, you actually don't get a penalty, but economists love retractions. It's a pretty small data set, all things being equal. And they find that when people retract for fraud or something that says misconduct or something like that, and not an honest error, you see a decline in your citations afterward. So of course you're going to try not to do it. However, the good news is, and this is sort of maybe unconscious or what have you, people actually don't cite. People don't slow down citations of your work if it says honest error, if it's pretty clear. We heard a bit about self-censorship already from people who have thought about this much, much more deeply than I have. So I really should just defer to them, but just sort of note, and full disclosure, Melinda's a former student of mine at NYU. I think you all know this sort of thing. I won't read it to you, and I'm just going to move on from this. But again, people are unwilling. And this is not, again, vaccines, maybe they became partisan issue. Maybe they became all sorts of things. But you know, it's not purely about just sort of an unpopular idea, although it sort of again became one. I think you all know about this case, or I would imagine a lot of you know about this case, where some Princeton researchers basically something was being misused, so they they removed it and then tried to clarify. They'd actually come to us with that story and then tried to clarify what they actually meant. And if I'm being honest, with all due respect to them, I think the message is quite muddled, to say the least. About what, again, you heard about this sort of already, so I won't spend all that much time on it, but the idea that, we can't retract if it's, we must retract if the conclusion is harmful, et cetera. So I probably sound like I'm agreeing that, censorship is a real problem in terms of retractions. And I do think that it is. However, I want to again contextualize it. And then sort of, all know about this. And of course, Corey was on the paper, at least one, maybe two, were on the PNAS paper, which I think was very strong 2 years ago now, that's been flashed up a few times already. But there was another, this was a retraction, right, of work by Corey and colleagues. Now, here's where I want to get a little bit, I want to push on something, right? And again, very briefly, because I want to get to questions and discussion. One of the things that we have noticed over the years is that there's a sort of getting Al Capone on tax evasion rationale to a lot of retractions. What do I mean by that? I mean that they are sort of, administrative, procedural. So here's a case. This guy was, was pushing hydroxychloroquine. He was pushing all sorts of things. He's a very, I'll just say, interesting character. He's an interesting character. So. But most of the retractions he's had, and he's going to have more because they're working their way through the system, are because he didn't get IRB approval, or the right kind of IRB approval, right? To do, and I think since I've already used profanity, I'll just use more, but to study shit, all right? And not studying it by he was just really collecting it kind of thing. And so I'm not going to argue for the ethics or whatever, but my point is, everybody actually has a lot of problems with the studies themselves, but what people are doing is they're getting them retracted based on these procedural things, which I would argue is going to backfire at some point, right? I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. So I'm not going to actually spend any time on any of these, but I just want to show you lots of examples where the censorship that we worry about, among others, is censoring critics, right? Now, I think this is going to resonate. I hope it resonates, actually. Because you, of course, are in the position of being critics at certain points, depending on who you are, where you are in that. So there was that. David, he was sued. He actually ended up, they put him in a lab at Purdue that he can't do some of his work, even though he's still tenured and everything else. You could argue, I would, that that's a sort of form of censorship. The whistleblowers on a horrible case where people literally died, they were the ones who were shut down, okay? Again, here's another one. Again, we have lots of examples of this. You have, again, drug companies that don't like when there's critical studies, they sue, which you could argue is censoring. We wrote about this in Chronicle of Higher Ed about a year and a half ago. We sort of summed them all up. You can read that. So I just want to leave you with this plea, okay? I would like to see more humility. You probably will say to me, Ivan, why don't you start? And that'd be great. You should tell me that. But these are cases where people actually said, you know what, I was wrong, right? And I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to go public with that. There are more cases than I've shown you here, but there are lots of them. People go to Nature and they publish there. Now you could say, oh, it's because they get a paper in Nature. Oh, fine. That's a pretty good incentive for this sort of thing. I'll just leave this here. I hopefully have made these claims, or at least flicked at them, as we say in journalism. But I just want to sort of, again, let's worry also about censorship of criticism and of critics. And let's be more humble. And let's sort of maybe at least think about overusing the word in a way that just sort of weaponizes it and then makes actual conversation about real problems in the scientific literature even more difficult to have. So, thank you.
All right, thank you, Ivan. We have time for questions, at least 6 minutes by my watch, and I'm going to use my bully pulpit to ask the first question since I have this very tough task of chairing this situation here. So Have you ever met a retraction you didn't like? Have you, so Lee was talking about these examples, which basically follow a logic where people don't like the results and they dig up some sort of, some people made up fig leaf, I guess was the analogy that he used, and where they maybe use different standards of rigor or to judge studies. So same studies that find opposite, more benign or acceptable findings will get no attention, will not get retracted, but different criteria are used. Do you find any evidence in your own, you know a lot about retractions, are there any cases such as the mentoring study or what have you, any retraction you think was pulled because of ideological reasons, not because of legitimate reasons?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'll do the same thing Jonathan did, and do we have to leave? Probably not, okay. I'll say a couple things. One is, basically, we don't like the way that the vast majority of retractions are handled, full stop, even if they're justified. So, because that's really what we focus on is the process, right? We're trying to provide data and you know, if not data, reporting, what have you on that. I mean, if you look at the mentorship one, if you look at, again, even if you look at the abortion one, this makes me very unpopular among sort of what I would say are more progressive reporters. I was actually interviewed a bunch of times about the abortion, the first abortion one I shared with you, and I said some things that apparently didn't resonate with their narrative because I wasn't quoted. And I'm not complaining about that. I mean, I get quoted maybe too much, so that's okay. But, you know, I said, look, you know, if you applied the same criteria, right, that paper was retracted, sort of under which that paper was retracted to the biomedical or to the most of the literature, like, I would just give up because never mind 2% of papers should be retracted. Like, I'm just going to make up a number, like 80% of papers should be retracted. So, and it's not so much that I didn't like it, it's that I don't like the precedent of we're only going to focus on that one. So I do think, and again, I don't love the sort of precedent of, although I see how it's effective, and I'm not arguing we should have kept Al Capone on the streets until we could prove that he had shot somebody, but I get the rationale, and I'm actually pretty sympathetic to it as this sort of institutional incrementalist. But I do think that in the long run, you know, retracting sort of purely for administrative or procedural reasons is going to backfire. And you already see that in terms of people saying, yeah, but there's nothing wrong with the science. And officially, there's nothing wrong with the science, even though we know there's something wrong with the science.
Do you want to handle the questions yourself?
Sure, yeah. I see one here.
Alex Arnold, Heterodox Academy. Your talk implicates all sorts of issues about the structure of incentives that people are subject to. Yeah. I wonder whether you think actually a real upshot isn't that there need to be more retractions. There actually just need to be fewer publications that have like this sort of formal imprimatur. Yeah. And I actually kind of wonder, I mean, my real question is, so publications are a coin of the realm. If we debase that coinage, or not debase it, but we want to replace it with something else, what do we replace it with?
So the thing is, we've already debased it, right? So that work's been done. And so let's figure out, I don't know, the next thing. And this is where I also, and I'm sorry to, you know, sort of pick on you, Lee, but it's sort of the best notes I took. But again, I think a lot of what, you know, this sort of notion of like write a letter, do the refutation stuff, like it reinforces those bad incentives, right? I'm not saying people shouldn't do that. I'm saying I don't see that as a solution because we have reified peer review, right? We have reified peer review. Now, Jonathan may argue with me probably from a position of intellectual sort of towering over me with this, and I would respect that. But peer review as a process, right, does not work nearly the way anyone is sold, the bill of goods that we are sold that it works, right? And so we need to first confront that or acknowledge it. The problem is, it's not just sort of political forces, it's not just even citations, what have you, it's an entire billion and billion of dollar industry, right, that is entirely, you know, dependent on that as a business model. Because what is the core value of a publisher? It is that you can trust what's in here in this peer-reviewed journal because it isn't that jetsam and flotsam, whatever I just said, that, you know, is out there without having been peer-reviewed. So yes, we need to do that. I'm a big believer in preprint servers. And actually, full disclosure, one of the things I do at the Simons Foundation is I manage our support of the archive, right? Physics, math, preprint server, okay? So I'm a big believer in preprint servers because they don't say and essentially lie to you that anyone has looked at this and said that it is peer-reviewed. And I just think this whole notion of false binary peer reviews, right, is just, it's peer-reviewed, it isn't, that's a big part of the problem too. And so what we need to do is, if we want to think like economists, let's incentivize the behavior we actually want, right, as opposed to the behavior that we end up with. And Alex, thank you for also giving me the opportunity for saying I had the pleasure and privilege of contributing a piece for the magazine, which I think is going to be published at some point. May get retracted or something. That'd be kind of fun. Yeah. I see a question here. I don't know if you want to move around or. I'm going to deliberately be more brief with my answer.
Ben Slifka, retired monopolist. My question is, John Ioannidis had a famous paper some time ago, Why Most Published Research is False. What's your do you have any comments about that paper with respect to your work?
Yeah, so interesting. I mean, obviously like I think the most highly cited paper in the top 10 or something of ever. And it's, by the way, it's sort of an essay, right? This is not like, it's not an original study where he actually, in some even modeling way, did that. And that's not a criticism. It's just like that's what it is. I think John, as in most things, but not everything, and he says the same thing, so I'm not really being critical of him, is certainly right, at least directionally. But it depends on what you not to get semantic, sort of making the semantic argument, what do you mean by false, right? And I do this interview at NYU a bunch of years ago, and I said, so John, it was for journalism students, so it had to be a certain, I shouldn't say that, it's just live, but like, it had to be a certain way. I mean, no, because they're not experts. I mean, you don't want to start talking about jargon. And I said, so let's start, John, what do you mean by false? And he said something to the effect of like, well, Ivan, I mean false. And I was like, well, that's great, John, now let's talk. I think that like, he's right, and that sense is right. And if you look, there are data behind it, or that came out after also. You look at, and Stuart Buck can probably cite this data even better than I can, but you look at cancer biology, it's, some outrageous number of papers can't be replicated, reproduced. You look at social psychology, which of course a lot of you look, et cetera, et cetera. Anesthesiology, by the way, which was the canary in the coal mine that nobody actually paid attention to and still doesn't. There's a reason why the guy with the most retractions in the world, 220 right now, is at the top of the leaderboard, our leaderboard of retractions. I think that's true. I just think that we have to, again, like sort of be honest about what it means. Like, if they were all preprints, would we be talking about them being false, or would we just be talking about them as being drafts? I guess I'll, and then we should go back, because there's a cluster back there.
Mike Bowen from Foundation for Free Black Thought. I had a question. Are you familiar with consensus AI? And do you think large language models can help sleuths in the future? And also, is there particular metadata that you would have on your database that says this was retracted for X reasons?
Yeah. I'm going to take the last one first because it's easiest, most straightforward. Our database is freely available now, thanks to an acquisition by another nonprofit, Crossref. About 55,000 retractions in there. We know we're missing, because we do them by hand, about 5,000, so we're getting there. But that's all available, and we categorize every single one of them by, we have a taxonomy of reasons. So you can literally download it, play with it, do whatever you want, print it out, make wallpaper out of it, wherever you want. But people have started doing that kind of analysis, and we think that's great. So yes to that. I'm not familiar, I mean, I've heard the term, but I don't want to misspeak. So I'm just going to say I'm not familiar enough with consensus AI itself to, to sort of speak with any authority there or any knowledge. But I will say that in terms of AI, it's interesting. And the short version is, it is, as most things are, a double-edged sword. And so, yes, I see no reason why, if we are willing to actually do the work of checking, of human checking, why that shouldn't be a tool like any other tool is. I will say, though, that it is making all of the problems, particularly involving paper mills in the scientific literature, much, much worse. So one of the problems you have is that people are then, and John's actually written about this as well, John Ioannidis, you have people just mass producing systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and this is mostly, again, in the biomedical sciences. But that are just absolute junk. And they're not even necessarily wrong, and that's where we get to this idea of like, what's wrong, what's false? They're just useless. And also, they're based on whatever it is that, you know, garbage in, garbage out. In terms of the sleuthing, people are already doing that. Elizabeth Bick, who I mentioned, uses something called Image Twin, which actually she focuses on images, and that's been useful to her.
So in the interest of time, this is going to be the last question here for more time for questions.
Sorry, I know there's a cluster back there, but I'm happy to speak with you, later. Or whatever, yeah, whatever, no.
Well, thank you. Maybe shouldn't be the last question, but I want to challenge you on your fundamental premise. And maybe this will be grounds for later discussion. I'm not a fan of retractions as a practice. They're a new thing in science. They really only came along quite recently. Science, traditionally, over hundreds of years, evolved a very effective way to deal with all the crap that's out there, and there's always been a lot of crap out there, mistakes, bad data, non-replicability, and that's to just let it die on the vine. The stuff gets published, and it kind of disappears because it's not replicable, it's not useful. No one's reputation is fundamentally damaged by that process of making mistakes. It's not a manipulable system. It's not public. It's not politicized. The whole practice of retractions has taken on a kind of ritualized nature. So my priors are we should be ratcheting back the whole retraction industry across the board. Save it for those very rare particular cases of outright egregious scientific misconduct, actual fraud. Other than that, forget it. People make mistakes, we move on. Comment?
Sure. I mean, so again, number one, I didn't say this. I actually said I would, and I didn't. So there's an opportunity to say something that I think responds a little bit. Very consistently, 2/3 of retractions are due to misconduct. So if, and the ones where I say there should be many more, those are misconduct retractions. So I want to be clear, and again, not a false binary here, but in fact, that it's just the way, when you look at them, that's true. Now, we have often said, and to get back somebody was saying, you know, oh, it gets retracted and we'll get even more attention to it, right? We heard that earlier. Well, actually, we joke, and someone else made this joke too, another time. Yeah, you want to get more attention to your paper, get it retracted. That'll zoom up your alt metrics and the rest of it. So, but on the one hand, Jonathan, I actually agree with you in the sense that I think that they're weaponized. I think that lots of things happen. On the other hand, I very much disagree with you that. And by the way, the first retraction was in 1756, which is new. I mean, the new thing is the growth, but it involved Benjamin Franklin. I'm happy to talk to you about that over a drink. So I think, you know, I actually agree that, but maybe my mechanism for doing that might be different. So my mechanism for doing that would be to not have so many peer-reviewed papers, right, and to not jam so much crap through a process that has never, ever, ever worked the way everybody claims it has. And the dying on the vine thing, I'm sort of at a very high level, I'm with you, except that every funding decision is based on citations. And so therefore, and the person who I find smartest on this, and who I gobble it up when he writes anything, is someone named Mario Bajoli, who's actually around the corner, wherever UCLA is. Mario has sort of made, I think, an excellent argument that nobody's actually writing papers to be read anymore. So dying on the vine has become whatever. I like wine a lot, and I don't like to see grapes die on the vine. It sort of doesn't matter if anyone reads them. It matters whether machines read them. He actually goes as far as to say they're being published in order not to be read. So I think that, there's a lot to what you say. And again, we think, and we've often said, retractions are not the best way often not the best way to deal with whatever the problem is, or whatever the alleged problem is. On the other hand, that ignores the sort of reality of the industry, like the industrialization of all of this, right? So, but again, yes, for more discussion.